Dr. Hopley, welcome to the Herculean podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here in your fabulous home studio.
Thank you. Would you start by telling us about your own journey into mental health and what led you to specialise in resilience and emotional recovery?
So I studied medicine in London. I'm a Londoner born and bred, and my mum had been heavily involved in healthcare. She'd been a nurse, midwife, health visitor, and I suspect I probably got kind of passively indoctrinated by her into the joys of a career in medicine. So studied in London, had a great time studying, and at the time when I was kind of coming up to qualifying, you make decisions about career direction, what specialty you'd like to work in. I happened to be at the time playing a lot of elite rugby, which took up an awful lot of time, and the natural kind of predictable career pathway would have been to do something like orthopedic surgery or sports and exercise medicine, something like that. But neither of those specialties would have allowed me to continue to play every weekend from August through to May without a lot of disruption. And I'd always enjoyed psychiatry at medical school. It was never a popular specialty in those days, partly because the sort of places you'd go to study or to work in mental health were pretty challenging. You know, they were old style institutions built by the Victorians many, many years ago and certainly not fit for purpose in the modern era. But I did like the fact that as a student, if you hadn't necessarily been a bookworm and done all the reading that you needed to do, in mental health, if you could have a conversation with someone, you were off to the races. You could get going. So that for me was quite a positive thing. And I thought, well, I'll give that a go and I'll see how it goes. And here I am 30 plus years later.
So Cognacity, which is what you've created essentially with your partners, it's doing incredible work in supporting individuals. And also you work with teams and a number of organisations. So could you share more about its mission and the kinds of challenges that you and your team address on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting journey that we've been on because when we first set up the group back in 2006-07, we were really clinicians just looking after people who had mental health problems, which was fine and still is. We still do a lot of that. But it was at a time when the NHS was starting to appreciate the importance of going from being reactive to proactive in the way that you tackle health. So a lot of GPs were encouraged to follow screening programs to try and pick up pathology at an earlier stage. And so working with two psychologists in our practice, Peter Kruger and Rob Archer, one of whom is a clinical psychologist, the other is an occupational psychologist, we made that step into taking what was really good evidence around cognitive behavioural therapies and related approaches like ACT and creating training programs so that people could really learn the skills that you might be taught if you were burnt out or struggling with anxiety and depression well before you developed these problems. And we had some incredible impacts in the early stages, working with one of the large corporate clients who were dealing with a global disaster. We ran a training program for about 1,000 of their lawyers, and we could demonstrate that after a half-day training session, 6 months later, there were sustained improvements in resilience measures, very scientifically robust. So we knew we were onto something then, and that's enabled us to spread that work out into a number of different settings. A lot of work is in the corporate space. A lot is within elite sport. Because of my background in sport, we have some good connections there. And so our approach now is to take, if you like, mental health and performance hand in hand and make sure we're optimizing both at the same time.
So what does a training program or a training day that you run in one of these companies look like? What do you focus on, and how do you get teams to collaborate, and how do you get the organizations on board in the first place?
Well, let's take the last question first, because that's actually been the hardest part of the journey. When we started out on this journey, there was a brilliant study that showed that if you looked at HR directors of large organizations, 50% of them believed that the incidence of mental health problems in their organization was zero. I know. Isn't that
Bit
staggering?
ambitious.
Staggering. And of course, we know, and it's been pretty consistent over the last couple of decades, that 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people in the workplace has got a diagnosable mental disorder. They may not know that, but it's the iceberg effect. There's a lot of pathology out there. The approach that we take is either working with groups, small or large, or individuals, and applying those skills I was talking about earlier through some form of training program. So for individuals, it might be that we would carry out some psychometrics to get a really good view of where they're currently at in terms of their well-being and their resilience. Maybe also some measurements of their personality structure and the way in which they would respond to pressure, particularly when it's intense or if it's chronic, because that gives us a really good clue as to the sorts of things that might make the biggest difference to them through a coaching program to help them to, first of all, understand themselves better, but then to be able to adapt some of their automatic thoughts and their behaviors that follow from that to modulate down that kind of stress response that we have. Working in groups is always one of my favourite things to do, particularly large groups of people, because if you can engage them, and there's always a few people who are highly sceptical about this, and in professional services firms, when you're working with bankers and lawyers and consultants and accountants, very intelligent people, but as the old saying goes, very intelligent people will always find reasons not to change. So engaging with them is a challenge, but it's a really rewarding one, because when you take someone who's a little skeptical and you get them to come on that journey with you, actually the impact is very significant, and not infrequently those individuals become massive advocates for what we're talking about. I think whenever you're engaging with teams or organizations, you're going to be doomed unless you get buy-in from the top. So with big companies, if we can engage with CEOs and board members and demonstrate to them, ideally running a group program, the impact that we can have, then you'll find that the approach will be much more sticky lower down the organization, because then it doesn't feel like people have just been singled out, let's say at mid-manager level. This is something that the whole group is kind of signing up to.
Mm. And what does a program entail? What does it look like a day? So say you run a day in a company like PricewaterhouseCoopers or one of the big legal firms. How do you run them, and what does each person participate in?
So ahead of time, we've probably done some psychometrics. So each of the individuals may have their own report, which they would have received before we start doing that. And then we'd have the collated group anonymized data, which we can then share. We're not talking about anything that's confidential. But the model would often start with some psychoeducation. By that I mean explaining our view of the mental health spectrum. So to put that simply, everybody has mental health. We used to talk about mental illness, now we talk much more about mental health. And we explain that people move up and down the mental health spectrum from really struggling with their mental health, mentally ill, all the way up to being in a great flourishing state, optimizing your capabilities on a daily, weekly, sometimes hourly basis, based on predominantly our engagement with stresses that are around us and life events and other things. Having got that across the line, we then make it very clear that there are different types of stressors that people can succumb to. And what we need to do is identify there are certain things that are outside of our control, particularly life events, things that happen at work, maybe related to clients. But there are also things that happen that are very much within our control. And the primary one of those is the way I was saying before, we perceive the environment around us. And most of us are subject to what we would sometimes call mind traps or cognitive biases, where something happens and we put meaning on it that might not necessarily be there. Quite often this is shaped by early life experiences. So something happens that reminds you of a difficult situation when you were younger, or a positive situation when you were younger, and you suddenly have either a negative or a positive response to what's going on. So if we can identify that through some further training and examples and some interactive discussions and use of videos, we can then help people to see what their own personal response to different scenarios are. So, for example, if you and I were in a conversation, let's say we were doing one-to-one work, I'd be very interested to know to what extent you're someone who's prone to catastrophizing or subject to the rule of shoulds, where you feel obliged to behave and do things in a certain way, whether you're an all or nothing thinker, things have to be absolutely perfect, otherwise, what's the point? And a whole range of other cognitive biases, because once we understood together your profile, then I'd be able to suggest to you, if you couldn't identify them already for yourself, ways to maybe work on changing that automatic response that you've got. And once you start doing that, you give people back a sense of control, and learning from either experiences before or events as they come to you, you can start to adapt and really reduce down the negative impact of stress on you.
Okay, so let's take me as an example. So I'm a catastrophizer. I'm an all or nothing person. Things have to be just right. Where would you start with me?
I'd ask you to tell me a scenario recently where that's happened, and you can retrospectively see that kind of thinking wasn't particularly helpful.
Okay, so let's take an example of this podcast. So I started it 2.5 years ago now, and we've done over 120 episodes. And I'm like, why am I not Stephen Bartlett yet? Why do I not have 10 million listeners a month? Is this all a disaster? Am I ever going to be able to make a living from it? Am I ever going to become influential? Is anyone even finding it helpful or listening to me? Am I delusional? And I just spiral.
Yes, yes. So what's interesting about what you've described, and it was very good that you were able to do this automatically, you've already broken it down into some of the, if you like, measures by which you're applying your success. The first one you said is, why aren't I Stephen Bartlett? Well, I would say to you, let's look at how many Stephen Bartletts there are and how many people are there doing podcasts. And I imagine if you plotted a chart, you'd probably find that whilst you're not right under him in the league, you're probably doing an awful lot better than many, 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 many people who are doing the podcasts. Also, how do you measure success? You know, is your podcast successful if you can influence one person for the good, or if you can generate 5 million a year? You know, that's a personal question for you in terms of your values. And a lot of our work does move over into that value space to help people to understand that actually some of the things that they're pursuing may not be the things that are most important to them. Not infrequently, I look after individuals who have been phenomenally successful commercially, financially. And they ask me, Phil, why aren't I happy? And of course, the reason is there is no connection, there's no correlation between financial success, wealth, and happiness. Quite the converse. There's some amazing research out there. So a study was done some years ago now that looked at self-rated measures of happiness and fulfillment. And it was found that if you were someone that either had a stroke or you were a lottery winner, if you charted your happiness about 18 months after either that catastrophic event or that amazing event, your happiness levels really came back to where they were beforehand. So whilst we have a sense of what might make us happy, quite often it's not founded in the reality that we know from the work that we do. So with both of those examples that you gave about the catastrophizing and the perfectionism, we'd unpick where that comes from, we'd unpick how that comes into play, and I'd help you to see how those automatic thoughts are really not that helpful. So a common scenario I use with catastrophizers is that, let's say you and I are traveling on a train. We don't know each other, but we're going on the same train and we're going to a very important meeting. Let's say you're going to meet your new publishers about a book that you're doing, and I'm going to meet someone to do with a renewal of a contract. And the train grinds to a halt and there's no announcement. And we both are aware that this is likely to make us late. And you start to think, well, if I'm late, I remember when I did psychology and I read about first impressions being everything, then I've probably lost the opportunity in that meeting straight away. And if that happens, and this is definitely the best of the publishers that I'm interested in, that probably means my opportunity to get this book out this year has gone. And if I don't get the book out this year, then the knock-on impact in terms of the return sales or people being interested in my podcast for all the promotion from that is going to mean X, Y, and Z. And before you know it, you've talked yourself out of being able to get that publication done. And you may arrive at the meeting in such a negative mindset that that's what's happened. At the same time, I'm going to an equally important meeting because I know a little bit more about this world. I know I can't influence when this train moves. I know I can't influence what people are going to think of me until I get there. So what I do is I get a book out and I start reading. Maybe reading over the presentation I'm going to give, just to give myself another little advantage. By the time I get to my meeting, I haven't caused myself to be additionally stressed. You have. So even though we're seeing it in the same way, our perception of what's happening takes us in two very different journeys in terms of the impact of the same stressor on us as individuals. So learning from other people is a really helpful way of understanding how we can think and therefore respond differently.
Yes, and I think that feeds into this concept of mirroring with parents. I hear a lot of psychologists talking about it, and particularly with this addiction to social media. And it's like, if you set an example to your child that it's okay to be on social media and your phone all the time, they're going to absorb that messaging. So it's a similar thing in a way. And that goes to the sort of, how a lot of dietitians say that if you want to go on a health kit, then surround yourself by healthy people and healthy friends, because bad habits are often reinforced by those around us. And it's interesting. So it's a similar concept.
Very much so. And that's one of the hardest things we have to deal with, isn't it? how we engage with technology, whether we're adults, whether we're children, whether we're adult children of adults, etc., etc. It's a constant struggle, constant battle. One of the reasons why earlier I said we're almost potentially exposed to stress continuously, and people that don't sleep well quite often reach for their phone, and that is the worst thing they can do.
So after you've done the sort of analytical dive with someone in a working environment, what's next?
It depends on what's come out from that. So the coaching process we use is a very simple model called 1+4. So the first session is about 90 minutes long, and we really go into some detail around the psychometrics we've done already on them and the key things that they are wanting to change. Or sometimes people have been kind of pointing in our direction because either things aren't going so well at work, or they're very good performers, but there's some elements of their behaviour that might not be going down so well in the organisation. And at the end of that session, we would agree, you and I, maybe 1 or 2 small changes for you to make and work at them over, let's say, 2 to 3 weeks. Then we come back, we have a session, review how it's gone. Quite often between the first session and the second session, people are so busy they kind of don't quite get to it. So then we really do kind of try and contract into that in a consistent way. And we try and find people around people who can support them. So it might be a partner, it might be a colleague at work, it might be somebody who's got a lot of kind of time with this individual. Well, once you tell someone what you're striving to do and they take an interest in it, it just does reinforce it very nicely. And then over the course of those 4 follow-up sessions, we normally see quite significant gains and improvements.
And can you identify some of the most common changes that people are trying to make? What do they tend to attach to?
Yeah, I think we've talked about it already, but it's about building recovery into our everyday strategies. I would say that is easily the number one. And then beyond that, it's really around some of the ways in which we engage with stress and our automatic unhelpful thoughts like catastrophizing, perfectionism, etc.
What are the red flags that you might alert a boss to in a working environment of someone who might be struggling with chronic stress?
Yeah, it's really interesting when it comes to mental health and the signs that are there, because actually we as individuals have those kind of like symptoms, what we feel ourselves, well before they become obvious to other people. So any of the education work we do around mental health awareness, and for a number of organisations, we support and we kind of supervise teams of people who've gone through their mental health first aid training, and they are volunteering to be mental health advocates because they want to, either they've been on a journey themselves or someone they know, and they want to make sure that people can access help as early as possible. So with that group, or with a boss we'd be talking to, we would be asking them to look out for changes in behaviour that usually last for kind of consistently more than 7 to 10 days, because that's often a sign that things aren't going so well. So is the way someone's communicating different? Someone who's normally spontaneous, responsive, if they're kind of not as present as much, or if they're normally very kind of civil, but there's a sense of irritability, or the way that they're responding is a bit curt, that's often a sign that the pressure and the stress is building up too much on them. Then inconsistencies, your good performers who, for whatever reason, are slipping behind deadlines. Again, we encourage people before they jump down a performance management question, think about someone's health. How are they performing? What's going on? And really important for people to understand that if there's someone, let's say that I worked for you, you were my boss, and you knew me but not that well, there'd be people that you would know, that I know quite well, that you could approach very, very discreetly, quietly, on a one-to-one basis and say, look, I've been slightly worried about Phil, he seems to be a bit quieter than usual, do you know if there's anything going on? And very often you'll pull together a picture quite quickly.
What do you recommend that CEOs, team leaders, bosses, whatever you want to call them, actually do with team members who they suspect are really struggling with their mental health or chronic stress? Because there's a fine line between invading someone's privacy and not wanting to make the problem worse, but also, it's a tussle, isn't it, between wanting them to perform for your company and also to look after them. And so what do you actually advise that team leaders and CEOs do?
Always ask. Always ask. Approach with care. So, pick your moment, pick the place, let someone know it's a confidential conversation. But the basic skills that we've all got in conversations are just what you rely on. Now, because it's something to do with mental health, we might get a little bit anxious about it. If you're feeling anxious as my boss, I'm probably feeling 20 times as anxious as you are, right? So for the cost that you've got of making yourself feel a bit awkward, you should definitely take that opportunity, because, God forbid something dreadful happens and you realise something's going on, but you thought, well, someone else will pick up on it. If you've got concerns, always ask someone.
It is alarming at the statistics now of the number of people who have been signed off work due to stress-related illnesses and mental health problems. And I think in the last year it was like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you advise that for companies, what can they do to try and mitigate the effects of, of people's mental health taking a dive, and to also keep people talking, actually encourage colleagues, as you say, to say to people, are you okay? Because once you get onto that sort of hamster wheel, it's very easy to lose sight of looking out for other people, and we're all trying to survive, and essentially in a competitive working environment, it's not that conducive to discussing how are you doing mentally. So what, again, do you sort of say on your days? What do you advise people to do?
So a number of the firms we work for, I mentioned that this group of kind of mental health champions, and if you can get buy-in for a number of senior people who are very successful, who are comfortable to share their personal story about when they themselves have struggled with their mental health and maybe even been off work, been off sick, it's amazing what an impact it has further down the organisation. The other thing that is, I think, really striking is that younger generations, people in their 20s, are far more comfortable talking about mental health than people in their 40s and 50s like I am. It's almost a norm for them, and partly that's because on the PSHE curricula at most schools in the UK, certainly for the last 10, 15 years, mental health, resilience, etc., that's just been part of what's there. So they're very, very comfortable talking about it, which means you don't have to shift the needle that far as an organisation to allow people to feel that the culture is open to them asking for help or sharing what's going on. And I would say in recent years, what I'm seeing, particularly in professional services firms, is that the struggle is for seniors who are hearing from people lower down the organisation that they are struggling and thinking, okay, so what do we have to do? Because it's a very competitive market out there for talent. The war on talent is really significant, and the firms that aren't getting it right, they're already starting to struggle, and reputationally it's very, very difficult once you've started to get a reputation in the marketplace for not being an organisation that looks after its people. I know a couple of the very big law firms who invest significantly in the support and the opportunities they give to students from school that come for summer placements, because I think they realise that the word gets back through these individuals to parents, and then the word kind of goes round and goes round. So my sense is a lot of organisations are getting much, much better at this, but there will always be places where people have kind of old-fashioned views. It was very interesting to hear the ex-ASDA boss today saying, in his view, people working at home are inefficient and everyone should be in the office 5 days a week. And of course, what we're hearing there is his own personal bias. The evidence doesn't support what he's saying. Yes, I'm sure efficiencies aren't as they would be if everyone was in the office full time, but actually there are some benefits to not being there the whole time.
Mm. I think it's very hard, as you say. I think people's minds are also a lot more adaptable and malleable at a younger age. And I think if you're dealing with a 40 or 50-year-old CEO who's maybe more set in their ways than maybe someone in their 20s, it does become very hard to sort of change the system. But I do think I would work for a law firm, and it was a number of years ago now, but they were absolutely fantastic, and they had the infrastructure. I was signed off work, and I divulged my mental health issues after I'd been working there for a couple of years, because I was very ashamed to do so beforehand. But as soon as I did, they had incredible systems in place. But it's very, very hard when you've been signed off work and identified as someone who's struggling with an issue, and to come back and to not feel that sense of shame and as though you're being judged. So how do you advise people navigate that path?
Well, we spend a lot of time advising HR professionals that they need to keep that relationship going, authentically active during the absence period. That's really, really crucial. So it doesn't actually feel like you've had this complete separation from the business, so that when you come in, it's like going back. We all had this, didn't we? Going back to school after the summer holidays. The worst was when you went from maybe primary school to secondary school, where you only knew half the people, and there was that sense of terror and what's going to be coming. But it's really important that those connections are kept there. And then immediately prior to coming back, that there's a meeting between an individual and their line manager or someone in that kind of role to, again, just address any of the concerns that you've got, make sure that the return to work plan is being agreed. Most people coming back after a period of time off work with mental health might not come back full time straight away. So you're working on reduced hours, which is a good thing, I think. And then what's the schedule for building up, and how are we going to check in? How are we going to support? It's crucial.
And I mean, again, it is. And I think regular check-ins once you're back at work and not feeling like it lasts for 6 months and then suddenly everything's back to normal. Because I think often what needs to be communicated more to these larger corporations is that actually mental health is an ongoing thing, and it goes up and down, and it's not a clear, it's not a straight trajectory. And I think people might be, if you employed someone who has got a diagnosed mental health condition, they might intermittently be signed off work, and that might just be something they have a bad patch and then they're back, and then they have another bad patch, and that needs to become something that is acceptable, and that person's not judged for doing so.
Exactly. And as part of that journey, to work out whether the work that individual is doing is actually the right work for them. And a lot of people struggling with their mental health are maybe a little too proud to say, do you know what, this isn't in the best interests of my mental health. And partly that's set up through expectations of education and where we've got to be and what we've got to do. And it's really important for people with those struggles, if they're seeing a therapist or a counsellor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, to really be honest about how they feel about those things, because I think, again, some of those assumptions need to be challenged.
Absolutely. And I think for me that was definitely the case, is I had to, a lot of my journey and my healings of power came in actually saying, I'm not cut out to be a lawyer. I can't manage the hours, I can't manage the load of stress. And I looked at a lot of my colleagues and they were just wired slightly differently, and it was coming to a place where I accepted that that's okay, and I can lose this reputation and the label of being a solicitor and working at a top international law firm, and actually, it's a shame, and I've tried it, and that's the main thing, and I haven't found it's for me. So I think, like you said, it's reaching that acceptance.
It's not easy though, is it? I mean, you have to be quite brave to first of all to give yourself permission to say it, and then to share that message. So I think you've done remarkably well. Lots of people would just maybe just hold back from that final step and just try and battle through in the hope that they can make it this kind of version of themselves that they had anticipated for a long time. But it's just not sustainable. It's not going to be good for your health.
No, I mean, I remember for so many years, and even up till very recently, whenever anyone asked me what I did, I felt this sense of like shame and judgment. And I would always say, oh, well, I was a lawyer and now I have a podcast, and I do still say it sometimes. And I'm just like, why do I even need to say that bit? But again, it's that feeling of not enough, not doing enough.
You're a liberated lawyer. That's what
I'm a liberated lawyer. Exactly. That's what I should say, Phil. So you do a lot of work with Formula One, and I'm curious to know how you build resilience within the drivers and the teams where they have such a packed schedule. They're going into, multiple different sort of countries, time zones, physical stress as well as mental stress. Where do you start?
Well, their schedule is just incredible. I'd worked with some people that have to cope with some demands in my time. But when I joined McLaren in 2020, you'd just look at the number of races. So in those days, they were doing maybe 19, 20 races a year. Now it's up to 24, plus other testing weeks, jumping across time zones, sometimes away for 2 weeks back to back, 3 weeks back to back without going home. It really is, it's brutal. Now, a lot of people that are in that space are really, I wouldn't say addicted to it, but they really love the kind of the cut and thrust and the buzz and everything that goes on. But again, the approaches we take, exactly the same as the ones I described before. What makes sustainable high performance? How do you engage with the pressures you're under? How do you engage with the limited opportunities for being able to reset and recover on a daily basis, but sufficiently that you can just feel that much more energized, that much more focused, so that at the end of a busy race week, if you're having to change a tyre in the pit stop crew in less than 3 seconds, you can do that even though you're feeling relatively tired at the end of a very demanding week. So the approach is exactly the same, but obviously it's just modified and tailored to the environment within which these individuals work. And it doesn't matter if you're the chef or the driver or anyone in between. It's exactly the same model in terms of how our brains are working under pressure.
For the drivers who are under a lot of physical as well as mental stress, I think, particularly Formula One drivers, where the physical toll that even a race takes, and the amount of body weight that they can lose in a race, and just all the external stimuli they're exposed to. And I can imagine that then stimulates them massively, so their sleep's then affected. What are the main pillars that you would focus on if they couldn't focus on every single one that you identify?
Well, most of them have come through karting from teenage years, so they're very they're very physically resilient. You know, they know what it's like to be exposed to G forces, to have the risk of racing in these very, very kind of fast cars around tracks in competitive circumstances. But again, it's the common things that we see. So quite often these young men need to make sure they put their phones away when it's time to rest and recover, rather than just continually stimulating the brain. It's really important. I mean, on the whole, they've got a very, very good set of professionals around them that ensure nutrition, diet, hydration is done to the max very, very well. But during a challenging season, during a challenging part of a season, it's very easy to feel things aren't going my way, feel a bit kind of lost, feel a bit kind of overwhelmed. And it's how you cope with those negative experiences that I think is what builds resilience. And that's why the people around these individuals, often their family or their partner, are crucial, because they are there in the kind of, you know, the still of night when someone's away from the team and away from the kind of bright lights of the media attention, processing what's gone on and hopefully processing it in a constructive way.
I know that building resilience is a big theme of your work. But again, so say someone's an elite sportsman, a Formula One driver, and they've got a really punitive, tough training schedule. As you said, they've got all the infrastructure around them that's supporting them. But within that, how can they help themselves build that resilience?
So what I'd be really interested to know, because they do have downtime, is how are they spending that downtime? What are they focusing on? If someone is just thinking back over things that haven't gone so well, there's a process called rumination, which is kind of churning in our mind things that are not particularly positive, trying to seek a solution. That can actually create more stress than the process itself, especially if we're thinking about something that doesn't necessarily have a ready-made solution to it. So what are they doing with their attention? What are they paying attention to? How are they enabling themselves to not end up having their mood kind of drop down because they're thinking more about negative things? How can we enable them to not feel more anxious because they're only paying attention to maybe the high risk corners or things that are going to come up in qualification that they're worried about? That's really important, helping people to be mindfully directing their attention onto the things that are not going to set off that stress response, and therefore enable them to maintain that level of calm and composure, and therefore not burn too much mental energy that they're really going to need during the race or during qualifying.
I think, as you say, I think rumination is something that can be incredibly crippling and draining. Certainly for someone who ruminates sort of on hyper overdrive a lot of the time, I know how wearing it can be. What are the techniques that you can impart, and like the wisdom that you, let me rephrase that. What techniques do you recommend people employ who suffer with an over-ruminative brain?
Well, it's really important that we don't get them to stop doing things they're good at. So quite often with people working in professional services, engineers, people that do have to solve problems, they love, you know, engaging in their mind and trying to work things out from different perspectives. So the key thing is identifying those scenarios where rumination is not particularly helpful. There's a term called affective rumination. So this is where you're ruminating and it's really having an impact on your mood, often causing anxiety. And it's very common in people who work, who take home with them their concerns about what's going on at work. A very simple technique is, if you find your mind going into that state, get out your notebook or your phone or something and make a note down of what it is, and say to yourself, well, I'm not going to think about this now, but I'm going to come back to it the next time I've got some work-focused time to look at it from a number of different perspectives. The other thing is to get people to say these things out loud. Quite often, if you're talking to a colleague, they might be able to help you to find a solution, or they might be able to help you to see that actually you're worrying about something that doesn't merit that level of attention. So anything that you can do to direct attention away from that thing that's causing you concerns, but at the same time giving yourself some reassurance that you've got a strategy to come back to it at some later point.
Mm. Again, with Formula One, are there systems in place where they can really support drivers who are going through mental health issues? And do you see them, encouraging them to still partake in the racing if they are suffering with their mental health, or do they actually say step back? I mean, in the middle of the season, what happens if a driver's suddenly like, I just, I'm so anxious and my depression's really bad? What's the protocol?
I haven't seen it in Formula One. I've been working Formula 1 for 4.5 seasons. I've seen it in other autosport race series, And it really comes down to the level of insight and understanding of the team, the person that's in charge of the team. Where it's done well, it's done brilliantly, because people recognize that someone does need to take a break, and they'll give them that time to take a break. Do you know the hardest person to persuade on the break scenario is the person themselves? Giving yourself permission to take time off. Suddenly all these catastrophizing thoughts come in. I'll lose my seat, I'll lose my capability, my reputation will be out the window, my team will lose confidence in me. So that's actually the harder thing to work on, to help someone to recognize that maybe for them what they do need is to take a break.
I think for high performance athletes as well, there's something very, very hard that comes along with retiring. And I think there's that feeling of lack of purpose, lack of sense of self, because you hear Bradley Wiggins talking about it, hear Chris Hoy, a lot of the cyclists, there is that sense of, who am I without this thing? And I'm suddenly gone from being literally someone on a podium and winning gold Olympic medals to just a nobody, and my body isn't what it used to be, and I can't perform to the level that I used to. And I'm curious, how do you help people address that mindset and find a renewed sense of purpose, or just being okay with being mediocre?
I personally experienced this. So I played 10 years elite level rugby at Wasps, one of the big clubs in London, sadly no longer exists. And when I stepped away from being a semi-professional, because I was 30 and it was that point where I had to kind of choose between professional career as a doctor or professional career as a rugby player, and I made a calculated decision that I was better off, stepping away from the rugby. For the best part of the next year, I felt absolutely no kind of status or value. I couldn't go and watch the team play. My brain, even though I was a psychiatrist in training and therefore very kind of aware of a lot of these things, my brain would not allow me to think anything other than I wasn't worthy to be there. And that was a horrible state to be in. I was very fortunate that I ended up then picking up rugby for a lower club and playing for 3 seasons down at the mighty Bracknell. And that was brilliant, because then I had more time to process that change and process that loss. And just as you say, the key thing is that loss of self-esteem associated with identity. If you've done something very intensely for a very long period of time, then when you let go of that status, it's almost like, it's definitely a bereavement, and it's almost like you feel everything you had has gone. So there are a couple of things we need to think about. The first is, during the course of an athlete's career, to ensure that they don't have that kind of overly developed sense of self being only as an athlete. We're all someone's child or someone's relative or someone's friend, and we have things we do outside of our sport. And actually it's really important, I think, for balance and for performance optimization, that athletes do things outside their sport, because it's a great way of switching the brain off. So preventatively helping people to see that they're not just that javelin thrower, or they're not just that rower. That's really crucial. Then when it comes to the transition, now a lot of athletes aren't fortunate enough, like I was, to be able to make that choice, because it might be an injury that takes them away. And when it's forced on them like that, it is a challenge, although the evidence suggests that it's not such a huge difference between whether you've got a forced end of your career or it's one that you've planned. The first 2 to 3 years after stepping down from that are marked with increased risk of mental health problems and all sorts of other difficulties. In fact, in that period, if you age match the populations, the incidence of mental health problems in the athlete group is higher than an age matched non-athlete group. So again, in that transition period, a number of the sports run programs to help people to just look at connections outside, look at rebuilding themselves. During the pandemic, the club I played for created a WhatsApp group for, we call ourselves the Legends. We're basically retired. We weren't that legendary, and I think there must be, whatever the maximum number of WhatsApp users, 350, let's say, something like that. And you could see that as a vehicle for mostly retired players, some current players, was brilliant for creating a sense of togetherness, belonging, appreciation, value, so that you could kind of, it's like a little antidote to that transition period that you get where you're just questioning yourself. We are the same person, we're just doing different things.
It's so challenging, and like you said, it is a stage of grief, and it is like, bereaving. I mean, yeah, it's really challenging, and I think especially when you've had you attach so much of your identity, and it's very hard not to then step away entirely. And you see a lot of them going back into coaching and sort of almost like sustaining that connection with the team or whatever. But that's maybe no bad thing.
No, it can be very healthy if you've got acquired skills, knowledge, and expertise. And then to be able to use that, that's going to give you a real sense of validation and appreciation, as long as you're doing it for that reason and not just doing it to try and exorcise the demons. And you will see some coaches who really struggle with that transition, and they're not great coaches because they're still carrying that kind of emotional burden and that irritability and that sadness, and it impacts on the way that they engage with players. And there'll be certain situations that might trigger them to remember how things were, and you might see a particularly unhelpful response in those scenarios.
And it's the same as CEOs. You know, you step down from being a CEO and you retire, and suddenly, you know, your mental health does deteriorate, and it does happen. And I mean, it happens commonly.
We have to prepare for any of these big changes, but retirement in particular, it's really important not to retire cold. You know, there's evidence to show that, particularly for men, if you've been working in a career for 30, 40, 50 years, you stop cold and have no real planned engagement with meaningful activities and things that will connect you with people. Very bad for your mental.
How important do you think it is to sustain meaningful relationships, and particularly in stressful periods?
I mean, it's one of the most crucial things, whether we're in a stressful period or whether we're not in a stressful period. You know, we're human beings and we evolved to be in social groupings and to rely on and benefit from contacts and connections with other people. Now, there are some people who are very, very introvert, who are very kind of avoidant, who prefer absolutely to just be isolated and to be separated, but they are in the minority. And the vast majority of us benefit from that kind of dopamine release we get when we're exchanging with someone. The whole thing about feeling listened and being able to listen and being able to help others, you know, volunteering as an activity to boost our mental well-being is really well established, because helping others just makes us feel better about ourselves.
Exactly. And connection is the opposite of addiction as well. So I think if you're struggling with your mental health, often a problem shared is a problem solved, or a problem halved. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
And it's been a real honour to have you on. And I think all your advice and the work that Cognacity is doing is incredible. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on, and it's been great speaking to you.